First, I want. All right. First, I'd like to apologize to those offended by my unsupported statement last week that priesthood is overrated. In the context of people using priesthood as a social status or a prestige marker, I believe it is overrated. However, I'd like to assert that priesthood is also underrated. The spiritual dimension, largely untapped, which is available to those who serve the Lord, is something we glimpse when we see miraculous healings occur. And I believe that much more is possible when the spiritual and physical dimensions unite, and priesthood is responsible in developing that unity. Second, I'd like to put out a reminder that we want our presenters to have opportunity to share their message prior to the interruptions from the participants. I would call to your attention the chat feature is available, so if you need to make an urgent comment, please use the chat feature. Now then, I'm not sure that we got the, let's see, we didn't get, now do we get the picture up?
The
We
picture
still
is,
have the sunset.
That's curious. For some reason, when I wrote move the picture, it should be giving us this one. And from some reason, our screen share isn't allowing that to happen. Let me stop and try again. Screen share. We got that one. Now then, do we get Bruce's picture in front?
yes, looks good.
Yeah.
Okay, now we'll go from that side. I got my screens confused apparently. I get to introduce our speaker for the evening. His biography of William W. Phelps, in my estimation, is one of the best biographies of the past decade. Research is exquisite, referencing is comprehensive, and I only found one clear error in 526 pages. Phelps was converted by reading the Book of Mormon. On page 36, he says, and I quote, "By that book, I learned the right way to God. By that book, I received the fullness of the everlasting gospel. By that book, I found the everlasting covenant. By that book, I learned that the new Jerusalem, even Zion, was to be built up on this continent. By that book, I found a key to the holy prophets. And by that book, began to unfold the mysteries of God, and I was made glad." Unquote. So many of us have been made glad by that book, and this evening I am made glad to welcome Bruce Van Orden, author of this brilliant biography, to address us. When Jonathan Neville let me know of the death in his family, at the same time offered the kind referral to Bruce Van Orden. The mix of sympathy, concern, and confusion, for I had temporarily not associated the Van Orden name with the biography I so respected. But Bruce has kindly agreed to substitute for his friend, who is appropriately cited in the book on the Benjamin Winchester and William Smith controversies. Neville has already addressed those mysteries on our forum. And so we are honored to have this Professor Emeritus with us this evening. Let us pray. Great creator and guide of the universe and all its history, we bow in gratitude and appreciation of the balance between history and mystery. For as we expand our knowledge, nudged each day by faith and research, we expand the frontiers of our ignorance, extending faith, continuing our search, looking with awe at the greatness of what you have done, feeling deep awe at the compassion shown by the remarkable gift of your Son. This evening we gather to share insights gleaned by Brother Van Orden in his book, a beautiful biography of WW Phelps, whose impact on history merits another look. And we ask your blessing in our speaker and on the Zoom participants gathered as we contemplate our roles, that we gain new perspective and are nudged by your Spirit toward higher goals. We would ask your blessing of peace for the family of Brother Neville as well. For we all share interest in the mysteries of what happens after the chapters of what this life can tell. And we pray for the Comforter to bless the Nevilles, the Spirit of inquiry to bless the rest of us as we look back at the history and mystery we are here this evening to discuss. We thank you, Lord, for the blessings of life that make us glad, the discoveries that give us hope, that show us our souls as you see unclad, the chance to love, to be loved, to spend eternity with you and your Son, to praise you, acknowledge you as the author of the history of Zion, yet to be won. Amen.
Amen.
I'd like to turn the, let's see if I drop out the screen share, then we should be able to turn over to our speaker. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Paul, and especially for that lovely prayer. You're very kind to call upon God's wisdom for us this evening. I appreciate the chance to be with this very fine group. I'm probably close to the same age as a good many of you. I'm 75, now retired, and have been through a great deal of history of this whole Latter-day movement and the Book of Mormon. I grew up in North Platte, Nebraska, so I'm really not too awfully far from a lot of you folks in the Midwest as far as my feelings. We moved out there with the Union Pacific. My dad started in Salt Lake City as a special agent, law enforcement officer, and then was transferred out there. And when we got out that way, we found out that our small Latter-day Saint branch was about the same size as maybe the group of people who also lived in town of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And one of his friends and major colleagues in the railroad was from that community. So there's a lot of history. When my mother knew a lot about the Book of Mormon, many of the other people in the branch did not, and so she developed a flannel board presentation on the Book of Mormon. And my love for the book came as I sat as her oldest child, as she practiced her flannel board presentation and told me all about the events in the Book of Mormon. So I've been closely associated with that book all of my life too. I was actually planning to quote that portion that was given by WW Phelps as he reminisced about his conversion when he wrote that story in the Messenger and Advocate in 1836. Let me just say that it was the Book of Mormon that really drew him to Mormonism. He was the editor of a major newspaper called the Ontario Phoenix in Canandaigua, which was just 12 miles south of Palmyra. And all newspaper editors knew of each other, especially if they were within walking or horse riding distance. And he certainly knew the people up in Palmyra. And when it was announced on March 26, 1829, that the Book of, or pardon me, 1830, that the Book of Mormon was available for sale, and he had heard stories about it, he dashed up to Palmyra and picked up a few copies, came back to his home in Canandaigua. He had a small bookstore in his printing office, and he actually put it out for sale. And he read a copy of his own along with his wife, and it was just a few nights where they spent a good share of the night time reading, and he was converted from that very point on to this whole movement. It took him a while to pull away from his newspaper career because he was quite well known and involved in politics, and certainly that year was a political year and a campaign year, so he didn't actually join up with Joseph Smith's movement. However, he spent hours talking with Joseph Smith before that year was out, and he knew that the Latter-day Saints were moving to Ohio based on Revelation. It turns out that he was arrested for investigating Mormonism by people who helped fund his newspaper. And in those days in New York, you could arrest a person for indebtedness. The laws changed just a year or two later, and that was impossible. But he was kind of put in debtor's prison for a month by these people who owned his or who had subsidized his newspaper. He had a chance to send out information about how terrible he felt being put upon like this, and his family was sick and needed him. And they finally released him after a month. And as soon as he got out, he gathered his family and got them on the Erie Canal and to Buffalo and on a schooner and down to Fairport, Ohio. And he walked the Ohio Trail for 12 miles to Kirtland and arrived on June 14th, 1831 now at the Isaac Morley home in the eastern part of Kirtland, and told Joseph Smith, I'm here, I'm ready now, I want to do the will of the Lord. Do you have a revelation that would tell me what to do? And Joseph was commonly did seek out revelations for those people who he knew he could use, and a revelation came forward. As it's in section 55 of both editions of the Doctrine and Covenants, the Community of Christ edition as well as the Latter-day Saint edition, section 55, and it said that he should be baptized right away, should be ordained an elder right away, and he was to accompany Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon on their trek to the west, to Missouri, to the border of the Lamanites, as they called it, to seek out where the Zion was to be built, the New Jerusalem. And sure enough, a week later, he was off with Joseph Smith. And it turns out that Phelps was one of the major contributors to the writing of the official history of Joseph Smith, or the official history of the church, particularly that portion of 1831 and 1832. He actually authored all of that. And all of our descriptions of Zion and what they did in that month or so in July and into August of 1831 out in Missouri are based on his knowledge and his personal experience and his own vocabulary of explaining what the land was like. I was going to make that quotation. Let me mention too one more thing about the Book of Mormon. In 1860, in Salt Lake City, at a general conference in April 6th, in honor of the anniversary, 30 years, Phelps was asked to speak, and he stood up in that tabernacle and held up that original copy of the Book of Mormon that he had way back in 1830, and testified his truthfulness, and was so grateful to have it. And that copy of the Book of Mormon is now in the hands of a bookstore owner, Reed Moon by name, in Provo, Utah, and he displays it along with the Bible that Phelps had in those days, the King James Version. So we actually have access to those original books. Let me now begin to share the screen with the presentation that I have here this evening. Can people see this? I'll slip over to the slideshow.
Yes.
Looks good.
I'll turn on the slideshow itself from the beginning. How's that looking? Can you see that, everybody?
Yes.
Okay. I'm happy to talk about any aspect of his life, and actually as part of this presentation, I do bring in various aspects of his life. This was a presentation I gave about 2 years ago in Independence at the John Whitmer Historical Association, and then it was published in the journal itself. To what extent was WW Phelps Joseph Smith's ghostwriter in Nauvoo? It was in Nauvoo that so much of what Phelps contributed to the church really came forward. Here's a picture of him. Photography wasn't really in existence so much in Nauvoo, but there was a photographic studio that was established in Salt Lake City in the mid-1850s. And this is a photo they made of him. You can see that he was about 5'11". He once mentioned that he was about 135 pounds. Here's another one that may be a bit earlier. This is the common photo that people have seen of him, but this was much later in his life when he was about 75 years old. And he did have a beard at that point. So that's unfair to have that as the one that people think of. By the way, let me mention too that when people in the Latter-day Saint movement here in Utah and other places speak of Phelps, they think of his songs. There are 15 of his hymns that are in the current Latter-day Saint hymn book, and they know of some of them. And that's about the extent of what most people have heard of him. And I'm aware in the Community of Christ that 2 of those hymns are sung with great gusto there. One of them is that Redeemer of Israel and the Spirit of God. And I've been to some of those song fests that are held on Sunday mornings from the John Whitmer Historical Association, where we sung those songs. This is an example of his signature. He always wrote his signature with a major flourish. Okay, many believe that Joseph Smith accomplished more in Nauvoo, both theologically and kingdom building, than any other time in his life. But was he a writer and a poet, as most people think or have alleged? My thesis is that while Joseph was a powerful orator, especially in Nauvoo, he was not a composer of prose or poetry on paper, and that the multiple writings and one epic poem attributed to him in Nauvoo's times and seasons were all composed and published by WW Phelps. That's my thesis. Joseph Smith was not an original writer. He used multiple scribes to record his activities and thoughts. His holographic writings are scant. They demonstrate his lack of capacity with spelling, grammar, and rhetoric in written form, as you look at some of those. So who is this W.W. Phelps? William Wines Phelps was born in New Jersey in 1792. He was 14 years older than Joseph Smith, as were many of Joseph Smith's closest associates and counselors in those early days. He grew up in rural Cortland County in central New York, participated in the War of 1812, met and married Sally Waterman, not too far from where he lived. They married in 1815. He had apprenticed as a printer. He was amazingly self-educated. Amazing how much he knew. Rhetoric, classic languages, history, geography, a lot of sciences. He was a skilled scientist in many ways. He was a partisan newspaper publisher and writer, and he joined the Latter-day Saints in 1831. Phelps was among the most prominent Mormons in the 1830s. He edited the faith's first two newspapers, the Evening and the Morning Star and the Upper Missouri Advertiser. This was in Independence, in establishing Zion, that community. He directed the printing of a Book of Commandments, and that was by assignment and by revelation that he was to do this, a collection of revelations to Joseph Smith. This publication was thwarted by anti-Mormon vigilantes in 1833. Most of you have heard that story. And the first place they attacked when they went after headquarters of the Mormons was the Phelps Publishing House. He spearheaded communication between church leaders in Missouri with Joseph Smith and other high priests in Ohio, up through that, and then after that. In 1834, Phelps became a member of the Missouri Church Presidency, and one thing that many people don't fully comprehend is that there were two church presidencies created in 1834, one in Ohio and one in Missouri. Joseph Smith had his counselors, Sidney Rigdon and Frederick G. Williams in Ohio, which also served as the first presidency when that came into full blossom. But then there was this presidency in Missouri. In 1835 and 1836, by assignment, all of the presidency and high council and bishopric from Missouri were expected to go to Kirtland for a few months to finish off the house of the Lord there. And so Phelps lived there for 11 months. And while he was there, he edited the first Doctrine and Covenants. They changed the name of the collection of the scriptures or the revelations to Joseph Smith. And then he also helped edit the newspaper, the Messenger and Advocate. He scribed for Joseph Smith with the Book of Abraham. That's a big thing. Phelps published the original church hymn book, Sacred Hymns, writing over half of the 90 hymns contained therein. He participated in a major way in completing the House of the Lord in Kirtland and in the dedication proceedings. And then he went back to Missouri. And with Edward Partridge, by the way, they were no longer welcome in Clay County, and the Clay County citizens urged them to leave. They weren't going to drive them out by violence, but they said, you got to leave or else there will be violence. And so they looked for a new place, and they scouted out land in they looked for all over the place in northwestern Missouri, And they did find a place on Shoal Creek that was relatively uninhabited and bought out the people who were there. And so they founded the city of Far West in present day Caldwell County. And by the way, Alexander Donovan, who was a lawyer from Liberty County and a representative in the Missouri State Legislature, together Phelps and Donovan worked to establish a Mormon county, and that was Caldwell County. With John Whitmer and using sacred funds, Phelps laid out the city and sold property. And it's important to note that they got in trouble because they were doing this unilaterally without working with the High Council or the bishopric, and they were chastised for it. They apologized and then placed the holdings in the hands of the bishopric. But they did get this whole set of things led to an excommunication for Phelps and John Whitmer. Phelps set up the location for a temple, and that temple lot in Far West is his choice of location, and he started the foundation of it. Thomas Marsh and David Patton, who were original members of the 12 Apostles, lived in Far West. They were not acting as apostles because the apostles could only work in tandem, but they wanted to have authority, and they led the insurrection against Phelps and Whitmer. It was really a power play and a coup, and drummed them out of the presidency and out of the church. But he got back in. Unfortunately, when Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon arrived in March of 1839, Marsh and Patton had already gotten rid of Phelps and John Whitmer. And when Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon arrived, Rigdon worked really hard to get rid of all the so-called dissidents and said that if you don't leave, I have all kinds of people who will make sure that you do leave, and you may lose your life, and you certainly lose all your property. So at that point in time, the entire Whitmer family and Cowdery and Lyman Johnson and many other people who were so-called dissidents were drummed out of town. But Phelps pleaded to not have that happen to him. He wanted to stay, and he said, "I'll make good with anything." And so even though he was excommunicated there in 1838, he was able to get back in. Unfortunately, however, when the Missouri Mormon War took place, a lot of people helped blame him and a few other people as traitors to Joseph Smith and Hiram and Sidney Rigdon. And unfortunately, he was excommunicated a second time in March 1839. That took place in Quincy, Missouri, pardon me, not Missouri, but Quincy, Illinois, by a uplifted hand in a conference that was presided over by Brigham Young. It was not an official court or anything, but by uplifted hand, about 15 guys were excommunicated. That included Phelps. So his family lived in poverty and sickness near Dayton, Ohio in 1839 and 40. In June and July 1840, Phelps sought forgiveness from Joseph Smith and received it. A lot of people have seen those letters that were exchanged, and it's a beautiful story. But he was so impoverished that he couldn't even make it to Nauvoo right away. So he represented the New Times and Seasons in Ohio, and Don Carlos Smith became the editor of the church's new periodical there in Nauvoo, the Times and Seasons. And Don Carlos Smith, who had learned the printing craft and trade from Phelps back in Ohio in 1835-36, had great fondness for Phelps and urged Phelps to write a few articles, which he did, sending them by mail. He did serve a short-time mission in New York in 1841, and then gathered it to Nauvoo in 1841 to work in the Nauvoo printing office under Don Carlos Smith. Well, Don Carlos Smith ended up dying in August of 1841 from pneumonia, probably, and it left the Times and Seasons in the hands of Ebenezer Robinson. He died unexpectedly. Ebenezer Robinson assumed ownership of the Times and Seasons. But then Joseph Smith wanted to have the Times and Seasons officially represent the church rather than just be the ownership of some individual. And by this time, Ebenezer Robinson was no longer seen and favored by Joseph Smith. And the 12 apostles had come back from their British mission and were now given authority over the entire church under the first presidency in late 1841. And Joseph had a revelation in January of 1842, saying that the 12 apostles should take ownership of the paper and officially represent it as a church publication. And Joseph Smith assumed nominal editorship of the Times and Seasons from March through October of 1842. And I think you've heard Jonathan Neville tell you about the fact that Joseph Smith really was just the nominal editor. And he did publish, there were several things that were published in the name of Joseph Smith that weren't really authored by him. What I assert is that the de facto editor, the person who really took over the day-to-day running of the paper and putting in so many of the articles and gathering other articles from around the nation and the globe to put in the newspaper, that was Phelps, I say, starting in February of 1842. And he continued to pretty much run the printing office along with John Taylor. Yes, he worked with John Taylor, but the one who actually did the most work was Phelps, I say, in those 4 years. It was in February 1846 that that whole thing came to an end, because Brigham Young and the 12 apostles led the majority of the Mormons out of Nauvoo, and they stopped the publication of the newspaper at that point. He also was the de facto editor of the Wasp and the Nauvoo Neighbor, I assert. So I say that WW Phelps ghost wrote for Joseph Smith in Nauvoo in 3 categories. 1, historical recitations, the official history, and then some other historical works, doctrinal essays, and political tracts. Okay, let's talk about the historical writings first. The first 2 compilers of Joseph Smith's official history that he started in 1838 were James Mulholland and Robert Thompson, but both died in 1839. Mulholland in 1839 and Thompson in 1841. And so it came to an end. And this historical narrative that has been started by Joseph Smith, talking about his birth and his growing up, and then eventually being involved in the first vision that's in there, and all these visions from Moroni associated with the Book of Mormon. The narrative had reached a certain point, but only up to October 1830, at the time of the death of Robert Thompson. In late 1841, Joseph Smith designated W. Phelps as the new compiler of the history, so he became the 3rd one to be the writer. So from December 1841 to December 1842, in his own handwriting, Phelps recorded 82 pages of history, which are pages 75 to 157 of that official compilation known as Volume A-1 of the manuscript history. It's also known as the Historian's Office History of the Church. And that covered the period of 31 October 1830 to 1 November 1831. And he himself was a major participant in that period of history, especially from June 1831. So thus he would have access to several documents of his own and his own personal memory. On the 16th of June, 1842, Phelps wrote a letter to Parley P. Pratt, then serving as British mission president, that highlighted his work on Joseph Smith's history. He wrote, "I am now on the largest amount of business that I have ever undertaken. Since I have been in the church, it is to write and compile the history of Brother Joseph, embracing the entire history of the church. It will occupy my time and talents for a long time, should nothing interfere." Beginning in late 1842, Phelps and Willard Richards, and by this point in time, Willard Richards, an apostle, had been designated by Joseph Smith as the official recorder of the church and of Joseph Smith and of the history. And so Phelps and Willard Richards worked together on the official history. One can read in the official history as it unfolded that Phelps and Richards were working on it. Phelps' assignment at the Times and Seasons included publishing serially the history of Joseph Smith as he had it, which began soon after Phelps started his work at the printing office. The history went from Joseph Smith's birth in 1805 to August 1834. That's when the Times of Season, it came out monthly, the history of Joseph Smith. And it took up to the period of August 1834. The Times and Seasons printed its last number in February of 1846. Well, Phelps later supervised the continuation of this serial history of Joseph Smith in Utah by publishing it in the Deseret News. So he kept it up, and that went through 1857. This history of Joseph Smith that appeared in Times and Seasons first, and then later in the Deseret News, was essentially the same thing that came out in the official history of the church in 1907 when B.H. Roberts published it. Even as WW Phelps began to compile a significant portion of the official history in early 1842, he assisted Joseph Smith with another historical piece that over time has come to be one of the most beloved early histories by the prophet, namely church history, they called it, but it's more frequently known as the Wentworth Letter. This piece was designed to go into a book or in a newspaper series run by John Wentworth of the Chicago Democrat. And by the way, John Wentworth was a famous newspaper man and later politician. He even served in Congress. So Wentworth was no small person who had requested this history, but Wentworth never did publish it himself. However, the Wentworth Letter, or church history, made its way into the Times and Seasons, into the official history of Joseph Smith, and at least portions of it into multiple popular histories. It's all over the place, the Wentworth Letter. This is a quotation from it. There's a lot of this Wentworth Letter that talks about events in Jackson County and in Missouri. And Joseph Smith was not there for this settlement in Jackson County and clearly did not know himself about this. So this is as obvious as can be that Phelps wrote this portion. A considerable settlement was formed in Jackson County. Numbers joined the church and we were increasing rapidly. And of course Phelps was among that number. We made large purchases of land. Our farms teemed with plenty, and peace and happiness was enjoyed in our domestic circle and throughout our neighborhood. But as we could not associate with our neighbors, who were many of them of the basest of men, and had fled from the face of civilized society to the frontier country to escape the hand of justice, in their midnight revels, their Sabbath breaking, horse racing, and gambling, they commenced at the first ridicule, then to persecute, and finally an organized mob assembled and burned our houses, tarred and feathered and whipped many of our brethren, and finally drove them from their habitations, who houseless and homeless, contrary to law, justice, and humanity. And you can see that he doesn't give a period here. Phelps wrote on and on and on without a period. That's just his way. Who houseless and homeless, contrary to law, justice, and humanity, had to wander on the bleak prairies till the children left the tracks of their blood on the prairie. This took place in the month of November, and they had no other covering but the canopy of heaven in this inclement season of the year. This proceeding was winked at by the government, and although we had warranty deeds for our land and had violated no law, we could obtain no redress. This is an example of how he wrote. One sentence. Phelps is either a ghostwriter or editor of other historical material in the Wentworth Letter pertained to at least the Missouri period up through 1839. I think he had a hand in the composition of the wording of how Joseph Smith described his first vision experience. I think that the Wentworth Letter is the best recitation of the first vision, even more than the famous official one that the LDS Church has put out. He also talks a lot about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon and his experiences with Moroni. He likely contributed as well to the language of the concluding paragraphs of that Wentworth Letter, dealing with recent missionary successes and future expansion, as well as the 13 declarative statements now known as the Articles of Faith. We do know, by the way, that some of those Articles of Faith had antecedents in the writings of Orson Pratt and Orson Hyde. So I'm not saying that Phelps came up with all of those articles by himself, but I think that the wording of them in their present form was of his editing. And I believe, since we have no antecedents of the 11th, 12th, and 13th of those, that Phelps actually wrote those. 11th states, we claim the privilege of worshiping Almighty God according to the precepts of our own conscience, and allow all men the same privilege to worship. Let them worship how, where, or what they may. I really believe that's a belief system that Phelps had and that he included in this. The 12th article of faith is about sustaining political authority over them, being subject to kings, presidents, and rulers. And then the 13th article of faith is very flowery, as it talks about we believe in being benevolent and charitable and obey and following what Paul said about doing good to all men. If there's anything praiseworthy, we seek after these things. I think that's definitely the flowery methodology of Phelps. But then this came out just before the 13 Articles of Faith, and this particular paragraph is quoted all the time as coming from Joseph Smith, and and of course it does reflect what Joseph Smith believed and taught, but I believe it's in the wording of Phelps. Just yesterday in my worship service here in Springville, Utah, returned missionaries who had just come back from France and were a senior couple, gave their report from their missionary service, and they quoted this and saying, oh, this is from Joseph Smith. Well, it does reflect Joseph Smith, and it's in Joseph Smith's name, but I assert that the wording comes from Phelps. Our missionaries are going forth to different nations, and in Germany, Palestine, New Holland, the East Indies, and other places, the standard of truth has been erected. No unhallowed hand can stop the work from progressing. Persecutions may rage. Mobs may combine, armies may assemble, calumny may defame. By the way, that word calumny was not a common word even back then, but Phelps liked it, and he used that word a lot in his writings, including the verb form of that, calumniate. He liked to talk about how opponents of Mormonism calumniated against Mormons. Calumny may defame, but the truth of God will go forth boldly, nobly, and independent, till it has penetrated every continent, visited every clime, swept every country, and sounded in every ear, till the purposes of God shall be accomplished, and the great Jehovah shall say the work is done. Joseph Smith assigned WW Phelps to another history writing project in July 1843, a year later. The prophet had received a letter from Clyde Williams and Company, a publishing company of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, requesting an account of the rise of Mormonism. Smith and Phelps decided to respond by including what had already been published in 1842, the Wentworth Letter, or Church History. Phelps wrote to the Pennsylvania Company and promised an article that would be matured and forwarded in season to meet your anticipations. In September, Phelps sent an article entitled Latter-day Saints, a slightly revised version of the Wentworth Letter, but essentially the same thing, along with 5 additional paragraphs that he composed furthermore. And he added this at the end, which is exaggerative for sure. He wrote this: since the organization of this church, its progress has been rapid and its gain in numbers regular. Besides these United States, where nearly every place of notoriety has heard the glad tidings of the gospel of the Son of God, England, Ireland, and Scotland have shared largely in the fullness of the everlasting gospel, and thousands have already gathered with their kindred saints. Well, maybe 1,500 by that time from Britain had come to Nauvoo, to this cornerstone of Zion. And by the way, the revelation that Joseph Smith received about Nauvoo called Nauvoo the cornerstone of Zion, to this cornerstone of Zion. Missionaries of this church have gone to the East Indies, yeah, a couple of them had, to Australia, yeah, a couple of them had, Germany, Orson Hyde had, Constantinople, Orson Hyde, Egypt, Palestine, just one guy, Orson Hyde, and the islands of the Pacific. It's true, a couple of missionaries that started there, and are now preparing to open the door to the extensive dominions of Russia. There are no correct data by which the exact number of members composing this now extensive and still extending Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints can be known. Should it be supposed at 150,000, it might still be short of the truth. A lot of folks have now studied the demographics, given all the members that were in the British Isles and in and around Nauvoo, and it's surmised that no more in 1843 than 36,000 people existed in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and here he's saying 150,000, and that's not even the fullness of anything. So you can see that he liked to exaggerate. He was a ghostwriter for Joseph Smith's doctrinal treatises. Early on in the Joseph Smith's official editorship of the Times and Seasons, Phelps placed documents into the periodical that over time has come to be known as the Book of Abraham. That came in. Undoubtedly, Phelps had a hand in preparing the Book of Abraham text for publication. And here are the reasons. First, Phelps was acting editor of the Times and Seasons and had the printing and editing experience to take the lead with the production. Second, Phelps had been one of the three main scribes to Joseph Smith when the prophet translated, as he called it, the Book of Abraham, and Phelps had compiled the Egyptian alphabet and grammar himself. Third, a portion of the translation completed in 1842, a good share of what is now in the Book of Abraham was translated, as Joseph Smith called it, in March and April of 1842. As historian Matthew Gray has expressed, incorporated Hebrew words to elucidate some of its Egyptian terminology, particularly in regard to Abrahamic astronomy, thus suggesting a possible Phelps contribution. Fourth, Phelps had retained in his possession additional documents pertaining to the Book of Abraham translation while he was away from the church, and he brought them back to Nauvoo with him. And because of his enthusiasm for the doctrines found in Abraham's text, Phelps could have urged Joseph Smith finally to publish it. Phelps may have helped edit the text and even compose some of its contents, I assert. And during the rest of his Nauvoo time, in the Times and Seasons, Phelps often inserted different things that he liked about the new doctrines that came out in the Book of Abraham, such as multiple gods, multiple worlds. He published lots of things. Of all the people in the LDS Church, Phelps did more to promote those new doctrines than any other person, which is also an indication that he was involved here in this publication of the Book of Abraham. During Joseph Smith's 8 months as nominal editor of the Times and Seasons, WW Phelps actually was the prophet's ghostwriter for 24 doctrinal and policy declarations that had either the ED or Joseph Smith's signature. ED standing for editor. 5 of these essays that had major doctrinal implications eventually made their way into the serialized history of Joseph Smith, which in turn was their source in LDS apostle and church historian Joseph Fielding Smith. Maybe you've heard of him. He was for 60 years the official historian for the LDS Church. He even presided over the LDS Church from 1970 to 1972 while he was in his 90s. He put together this book, Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith. And out here in Utah, among the Mountain Mormons, people quote from Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith as if it were scripture. It was first published in 1938 and has seen multiple printings. Apostle Smith left no indication that it was no other person than Joseph Smith who composed all these doctrinal treatises. These 5 that I cite are Try the Spirits, Baptism for the Dead, Gift of the Holy Ghost, The Government of God, and Baptism. From Try the Spirits, which occupies nearly 5 pages of dense text in the newspaper and 13 pages in Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, we read Phelps's typical rhetoric that contains probing questions. Here's an example. Try the spirits, but what by? Are we to try them by the creeds of men? What preposterous folly, what sheer ignorance, what madness. Try the emotions and actions of an eternal being, for I contend that all spirits are such, by a thing that was conceived in ignorance and brought forth in folly, a cobweb of yesterday. Angels would hide their faces and devils would be ashamed and insulted and would say, Paul we know and Jesus we know, but who are ye? Let each man of society make a creed and try evil spirits by it, and the devil would shake his sides. It is all that we should ask, all that he would desire. Yet many of them do this, and hence many spirits abroad in the world. One great evil is that men are ignorant of the nature of spirits, their power, laws, government, intelligence, etc. And imagine what that when there is anything like power, revelation, or vision manifested that must be of God. Hence the Methodists, Presbyterians, and others frequently possess a spirit that will cause them to lay down, and during its operation, animation is frequently entirely suspended. They consider it to be the power of God and a glorious manifestation from God. A manifestation of what? Is there any intelligence communicated? Are the curtains of heaven withdrawn? Or the purposes of God developed? They have seen and conversed with, have they seen or conversed with an angel, or have the glories of futurity burst upon their view? No. Well, anyone who really knows the rhetoric of Joseph Smith would recognize this isn't how he spoke. He didn't speak this way. This is Phelps. In behalf of Joseph Smith, with his clearly decipherable style and use of a Latin phrase, Phelps introduced the essay on baptism for the dead with this logic. He used other languages. The great designs of God in relation to the salvation of the human family are very little understood by the professedly wise and intelligent generation in which we live. Various and conflicting are the opinions of men concerning the plan of salvation, the requisitions of the Almighty, the necessary preparations for heaven, the state and condition of departed spirits, and the happiness or misery that is consequent upon the practice of righteousness and iniquity according to the several notions of virtue and vice. The Mussulman condemns the heathen, the Jew and the Christian, and the whole world of mankind that reject the Quran as infidels, and consigns the whole of them to perdition. The Jew believes that the whole world that will reject his faith and not circumcised are Gentile dogs and will be damned. The heathen are equally as tenacious about their principles, and the Christian consigns all to perdition who cannot bow to his creed and submit to his ipse dixit. He used the Latin phrases all the time. Ipse dixit means he said to himself, or dogmatic expression of opinion. But while one portion of the human race are judging and condemning the other without mercy, the great parent of the universe looks upon the whole of the human family with a fatherly care and a paternal regard. He views them as his offspring, and without any of these contracted feelings that influence the children of men, causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends his rain on the just and unjust. He holds the reins of judgment in his hands. And so Phelps liked to show that God has spoken through his prophet, Joseph Smith, in these latter days here. He served as the ghostwriter for Joseph Smith's poetic paraphrase of the vision. Vision is that one of the 3 degrees of glory. And after Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon had received that vision in Hiram, Ohio in 1832, Joseph sent a copy of it to Phelps to be published in the Times and Seasons. And he did. And Phelps called it the vision, and it's been known as that for, quite frequently. Well, in 1843, Phelps suggested that there should be a poetic paraphrase of this, and he suggested that Joseph Smith could write it, and then in the name of Joseph Smith, he wrote it. For over 100 years, a 78 stanza poem, it's really long, with the signature of Joseph Smith dealing with themes found in the Vision, Doctrine and Covenants 76, fell into obscurity. The poem was published in 1843 in the Times and Seasons. It was the answer to Phelps's open invitation in his poem from WW Phelps to Joseph Smith, the prophet Vade Mecum, which translated means go with me. To this very day, many proponents of Joseph Smith's teachings continue to attribute this versification of arguably the prophet's most significant revelation to be Smith's composition alone. However, I and several other people, but quite impressively, music historian Michael Hicks has debunked this notion through scholarly means, and this is what Michael Hicks has written about it. To assess the poem's authenticity, we must consider its cultural context, the literary habits of early Mormons, their methods for producing poems, and this poem's specific background. We must also scrutinize the structure and diction of the poem. Does it ring true to Joseph's already established voice? Finally, we must sift through whatever manuscript sources might answer a fundamental question. Did Joseph have both the occasion and the ability to write the poem? As it turns out, virtually all the evidence in these matters weighs against Joseph Smith as the poem's author and points instead to WW Phelps. Following our samples from the 78 stanzas of verse in this lengthy poem written by Phelps on behalf of Joseph Smith, Phelps labeled each stanza with a number. Phelps included additional doctrinal insights. Okay, the 1832 vision had lots of doctrinal insights, but from 1832 to 1843, additional doctrinal insights had come through revelation and through Joseph Smith's teachings. And so he included some of these additional ones, and the newer doctrines are in italics. I'll show you an example here. This is stanza 11. I, Joseph, in spirit beheld, and the eyes of the inner man truly did see. But then these 2 lines are actually additional things that were not in that vision. Eternity sketched in a vision from God of what was and now is and yet is to be. Stanza 12, those things which the Father ordained of old before the world was or a system had run. This idea of these things having come forth before the world was. That's doctrine of Joseph Smith, all right, but was not in that vision. Through Jesus, the maker and savior of all, the only begotten Messiah, his son. Stanza 45. They're priests of the order of Melchizedek. He added that. Like Jesus, from whom this highest reward, receiving a fullness of glory and light, as written, they're gods, even the sons of the Lord. The idea of multiple gods had come forth later. 46. So all of things are theirs, yea, of life or of death, yea, whether things now or to come, all are theirs. And they are the Savior's, and he is the Lord's, having overcome all as eternity's heirs. That poem, a lot of people think was written by Joseph Smith. Even many people today think so. But in scholarly study, we've come to realize that Phelps did it. The third area, he was a ghostwriter for Joseph Smith's political writings. Starting in February 1843, WW Phelps represented Joseph Smith in all matters political, as he became a Nauvoo city councilor and Smith's chief assistant and legal representative on the city council and the mayor's court. By the way, Joseph Smith was both executive and judicial. He was the judge of the mayor's court at the same time. Phelps became increasingly vocal in council meetings and the proceedings of the court. Phelps applied ingenious journalistic tactics to promote Joseph Smith. One method, considerable dishonorable in the 21st century, was to use a pseudonym to write a favorable review of Joseph as if the writer were an outside observer. Phelps had done this before, but now he would put this method to strategic use. Under the name of a traveler, that was his pseudonym, Phelps wrote a highly laudatory piece in the Nauvoo Neighbor about General Smith that included the following, quote, Mr. Smith is a man possessing a good disposition, a strong mind, and a liberal heart. His theme appears to be religion, but still he is free to converse on all subjects. He has a thorough knowledge of the scriptures, while on the other hand is not unfamiliar with the pages of Blackstone, meaning the law. And I believe he has a very correct view on points of law most difficult to decide. Eventually in 1844, with the advice of many counselors around him, Joseph Smith opted to make a run for the presidency of the United States. There's a new book out, by the way, on Joseph Smith's run for the presidency, and it's really good and talks about the reasons why. The biggest single reason why Joseph decided to do this is because they had tried in vain so many ways and so many years to get redress for their grievances and being driven out of Missouri, and they were not being, their rights were not being upheld, and things were getting tight in Illinois also. So they figured they had to make a public appeal for their rights. Phelps became Smith's ghostwriter for all of Smith's political tracts, including the highly loquacious platform, General Smith's views on the power and policy of the government of the United States. This platform occupied 5 pages in Times and Seasons, 5 long pages. The first 2 paragraphs of views demonstrate Phelps's style and certainly not that of Joseph Smith. For example, born in a land of liberty and breathing an air uncorrupted with the sirocco of barbarous climes, I, supposedly Joseph, I ever feel a double anxiety for the happiness of all men, both in time and in eternity. My cogitations, like Daniel's, have for a long time troubled me when I viewed the condition of men throughout the world, and more especially in this boasted realm where the Declaration of Independence hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But at the same time, some 2 or 3 millions of people are held as slaves for life, because the spirit in them is covered with a darker skin than ours. And hundreds of our own kindred, for an infraction or supposed infraction of some overwise statute, have to be incarcerated in dungeon glooms, like Joseph Smith was, or suffer the more moral penitentiary gravitation of mercy. In a nutshell, while the dualist, the debauchee, and the defaulter for millions and other criminals take the uppermost rooms of feasts, or like the bird of passage find a more congenial climb by flight. This is all part of the platform. The wisdom which ought to characterize, this is also from the platform, the wisdom which ought to characterize the freest, wisest, and most noble nation of the 19th century should, like the sun in his meridian splendor, warm every object beneath its rays, and the main efforts of her officers, who are nothing more or less than the servants of the people, ought to be directed to ameliorate the condition of all, black or white, bond or free. For the best of books says, God hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on the face of the earth. And it is true that some of the platform did promote the freeing of the slaves and an equality for the black race. Phelps also wrote other political tracts in the name of Joseph Smith, and they are contained in a compilation that was to be meant to be part of the presidential campaign. It was a compilation. And its title was The Voice of Truth, contained the public writings, portrait, and last sermon of the President Joseph Smith. Turned out to be his last sermon. They included the platform views, but also other articles such as an appeal to the free men of the state of Vermont, the brave Green Mountain Boys and honest men, correspondence of General Joseph Smith and the Honorable John C. Calhoun, correspondence between General Joseph Smith and Honorable Henry Clay, Pacific Innuendo, a friendly hint to Missouri, and the Globe. The official history of Joseph Smith contains repeated references to Smith and Phelps working together on these tracts. And all these political tracts, Phelps was likewise immensely verbose and exaggerative. An example, in an appeal to the freemen of the state of Vermont, Phelps, writing on behalf of Joseph Smith, began, I was born in Sharon, Vermont, 1805, where the first quarter of my life grew with the growth and strengthened the strength of that firstborn, meaning Vermont, state of the United 13. Vermont was even part of the United 13. From the old French War to the final consummation of American independence, my father's heart to heart and shoulder to shoulder with the noble fathers of our liberty fought and bled. That's not true. I mean, his father and his grandfather and his two grandfathers did not fight in the Revolution, fought and bled, and with the most of that venerable band of patriots, they have gone to rest, bequeathing a glorious country with all her inherent rights to millions of posterity. Like other honest citizens, I not only, when manhood came, sought my own peace, prosperity, and happiness, but also the peace, prosperity, and happiness of my friends, and with all the rights and realm before me, and the revelation of Jesus Christ to guide me in all truth. This is Phelps writing in behalf of Joseph Smith. I had good reason to enter into the blessings and privileges of an American citizen, the rights of a Green Mountain boy, unmolested, and enjoy life and religion according to the most virtuous and enlightened customs, rules, and etiquette of the 19th century. But to the disgrace of the United States is not so. These rights and privileges, together with a large amount of property, have been wrested from me and thousands of my friends by lawless mobs in Missouri, supported by executive authority, and the crime of plundering our property, and the unconstitutional and barbarous act of our expulsion, and even the inhumanity of murdering men, women, and children, have received the password of justifiable by legislative enactments, and horrid deeds, doleful and disgraceful as they are, have been paid for by our government. So you can see that he exaggerated and really tried to make the point, and it was, of course, Phelps who composed this. In subsequent paragraphs, Phelps strived to demonstrate Joseph Smith's supposed facility with languages by citing political mottos from Chaldean, Egyptian, Greek, French, Turkish, German, Syriac, Spanish, ancient, Samaritan, Italian, Hebrew, Danish, ancient Saxon, Swedish, Polish, Native American, and Latin. He quoted political mottos from all those languages. It appeared to neither Smith nor Phelps that they were laying it on a bit too thick. In this tract meant for citizens of Vermont, Phelps recited an untruth, not merely an exaggeration, about Joseph Smith's father, Joseph Smith Sr. My father, who stood several times in the battles of the American Revolution, till his companions in arms had been shot dead at his feet, were forced from his home in far west Missouri, Joseph Smith Sr., by those civilized or satanized savages in the dreary season of winter to seek a shelter in another state, and the vicissitudes and sufferings consequent to his flight brought his honored gray head to the grave a few months after. And that's true. Joseph Smith Sr. did die in Nauvoo not too many months after being driven from Missouri. But in truth, Joseph Smith Sr. was born the 12th of July, 1771 in Topsville, Massachusetts. He would have only been 4 years old when the Revolution began in 1775 and 12 years old when the Revolution ended in 1783. None of the elder Smith's biographers record that he participated in the American Revolution or in any war battles thereafter. So you can see that was an untruth. WW Phelps proved to be of immense value to Joseph Smith during the prolific Nauvoo years. Smith was not accustomed to composing essays and poetry on his own, so he turned to the man who thought he was the most learned man in Mormonism. Phelps thought that, and he probably was. Even though Phelps often had severe bouts with pride, most of those were in New York, Ohio, and Missouri earlier. For the most part in Nauvoo, Phelps was willing to allow Joseph Smith all the credit for this immense amount of ghostwriting. Because of so many of these writings bear the signature of Joseph Smith or as editor, when he was nominal editor of the Dove Times and Seasons, generations of Mormons came to believe that Smith actually composed all these significant theological and political pieces. More recent scholarship has demonstrated that William Wines Phelps is the ghostwriter. Anyway, this is the biography that I've written on him. And I guess that ends my discussion. And certainly I'm ready for any of your time that you want to ask questions or be part of the dialogue. Thank you. Paul, you're not unmuted.
Again,
There you
there.
go.
Now, thank you very much for your presentation. And there's a bunch of these students of mine that are trying to earn A's, and to do so, they clearly need to get their good questions in. And so let me step aside and give them that chance.